It started with boots crunching on gravel outside my cabin gate. I looked up from my porch coffee and saw them four bulky guys in black polos, sunglasses, and cheap badges that read HOA security. Behind them, Karen strutted forward in her blazing red suit, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon. One of the officers puffed out his chest and barked, "Open the gate, we have authority here. Authority. On my land." I nearly spit out my coffee. Karen was shouting about violations, illegal cabins, and how I was trespassing on my own property. The scene was so ridiculous I almost laughed, but I could feel the tension rising fast. What they didn't realize was that I had backup they'd never expect. And when that backup roared over the hill on Harleys, the entire showdown flipped on its head. Before we get into the chaos, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? When I first bought my cabin in the mountains, it felt like the final victory over the chaos of suburban HOA life. You know, the type letters about grass height, nasty notes about unsightly trash bins, or the classic fine for leaving your pickup truck in your own driveway? I thought I had left all that nonsense behind the moment I signed the deed to this piece of land. The cabin wasn't much when I got it. Just a log frame, a creaky porch, and a stone chimney that needed a new flue. But I loved it. The place smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the mornings were filled with birdsong instead of HOA board meetings. My nearest neighbors were half a mile down the ridge, and the only rules were the ones Mother Nature handed down. Chop your own wood, keep your fire under control, and respect the land. That's it. Of course, there's always one person who can't stand to let others live free. Enter Karen. She lived just beyond the bend of the road in a gaudy McMansion built where the forest had been bulldozed flat. Every time I drove past, she would stand at the edge of her property, like a sentry glaring at me. The problem, according to her, was simple. My cabin wasn't part of her HOA, and that drove her insane. At first, it was little things. A note stuffed under my gate warning me that my unpainted fence posts were a violation. A complaint that the sound of my chainsaw was disturbing the neighborhood ambiance. Then came the letters printed on paper with the HOA logo, accusing me of refusing to pay dues to an organization I wasn't even a member of. I tossed them straight into the wood stove. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer, and when people like her run out of letters, they start sending muscle. That morning had started off beautifully. A crisp mountain breeze drifted through the open window. The smell of bacon was sizzling from the cast iron pan, and my cousins, both former Army, both big as oak trees, were still asleep in the guest room after a late night of cards and whiskey. I thought the day was going to be nothing more than chopping some wood and maybe taking a ride into town for supplies. Then came the sound of engines. Not Harleys, not the low, proud thunder of chrome and steel. These were rougher, uneven pickup trucks with mufflers barely hanging on. I stepped out onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, and there they were. 3 trucks lined up at the end of my gravel drive, forming a blockade like they were about to launch a raid. Doors swung open, and out climbed a gang of men dressed in black polos with the words HOA Security stitched on the chest in block letters. The stitching was crooked, like someone's cousin had run it off on a cheap embroidery machine. A few of them wore mirrored sunglasses, but that didn't hide the tattoos crawling up their necks. Karen herself followed, high heels clicking on the gravel red suit blazing like a stop sign in the morning light. She waved her clipboard as if it were a badge. "Open up," one of the men barked, stomping toward the gate. "This property is under HOA authority now." I almost laughed. Authority. From a group that looked more like a discount motorcycle club than law enforcement, I leaned against the porch post and took another sip of coffee. "This isn't your jurisdiction," I called back. "In fact, it's not anyone's jurisdiction but mine. You boys are trespassing." Karen jabbed her finger at me through the bars of the gate. "You can't just build whatever you want whenever you want. This cabin is a violation of HOA bylaws. We've had multiple complaints." "Complaints," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "From who? The squirrels, the deer?" That got a chuckle out of me, but the security guys didn't think it was funny. One of them puffed up his chest and rattled the padlock on the gate. "Ma'am," he growled, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Behind him, Karen beamed like she had just unleashed her personal SWAT team. The absurdity of it nearly made me choke on my coffee. Still, I could feel the heat rising in my chest. This wasn't just about a clipboard full of fake fines anymore. This was intimidation. I set my mug down slowly, careful not to spill a drop. My voice stayed calm, but my jaw was tight. "You're on private land. You don't have a warrant. You don't have authority. The only thing you've got is a bad case of trespassing. So, unless you plan on mowing my grass while you're at it, I suggest you get off my driveway." That's when Karen lost it. Her voice shot up 2 octaves as she screeched, "I'll have you evicted. This is illegal construction. My security team has the right to remove you." She actually said my security team, as if she were the general of some HOA militia. The men shifted awkwardly as though they weren't entirely sure if they'd signed up to intimidate homeowners or just help Karen carry her groceries. Still, they held their ground, glaring at me like I was the problem. My blood was boiling, but I held myself back. Because deep down I knew something they didn't. Inside the cabin just feet away, my cousins were waking up. And when they heard what was going on, I knew all hell was about to break loose. The HOA security men spread out across my gate like they were staging for a military drill. One leaned against the hood of his pickup arms, folded, flexing, like he was auditioning for a bad action movie. Another gripped the bars of my gate, rattling them as if the lock would magically snap from intimidation alone. I just stood there on the porch, mug in one hand, the other resting on the rail. I'd faced scarier people in line at the DMV. But these guys carried themselves with a dangerous mix of overconfidence and cheap theatrics, the sort of men who got loud when someone else was watching. And watching, of course, was Karen. She strutted to the center of the gravel road heels, wobbling slightly on the loose stones. Her clipboard smacked against her thigh as she puffed her chest, glaring at me like I'd just keyed her Lexus. "You have 3 violations pending against you," she announced, as though this was a courtroom. First, illegal woodcutting. Second, unregistered structure. And third, unauthorized occupancy. That means you're trespassing in your own cabin. These men, she gestured grandly at her hired muscle, have the right to enforce HOA bylaws. I couldn't help myself. I burst out laughing. "Enforce bylaws," I said, wiping a tear of mirth. "Karen, the only thing these guys look like they can enforce is a pizza delivery schedule." The tallest of the so-called officers bristled, his neck tattoo twitching as his jaw clenched. "Watch your mouth, old man. We don't take disrespect lightly." "Old man?" I shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Buddy, I've chopped logs bigger than you." That got a chuckle from somewhere behind me. My cousins were up. I heard the creak of floorboards and the low murmur of voices inside. They hadn't come out yet, but just knowing they were awake steadied me. Karen's face turned beet red. She whipped open her clipboard and started flipping through papers with the fury of a banker foreclosing on a lemonade stand. "Don't play dumb," she shrieked. "Your cabin sits on land we consider within the HOA community zone. You're bound by our bylaws whether you like it or not. And if you refuse to comply," she jabbed a finger toward her men, "my security team will remove you." One of the men spat into the gravel for effect, another cracked his knuckles. It was almost comical, like they were following a script. I leaned against the post, calm as a monk. "Remove me, huh? From land I legally own? By all means, gentlemen, step across that gate. But I warn you, my coffee's hot, and so is my temper." The bravado faltered for a second. One of them shifted his weight, clearly not eager to test the line. But the leader, tattooed broad-shouldered with mirrored shades, took a step closer and growled, "We don't need permission. HOA security is above county authority." That did it. I nearly doubled over laughing. Above county authority, what's next? Gonna tell me you outrank the sheriff, maybe the governor? Even my cousins couldn't stay quiet anymore. The screen door creaked open, and out stepped Jake, 6'4" with shoulders like a barn beam. His army shirt clung to his frame tattoos, peeking out beneath the sleeves. Right behind him came Mark, shorter but stockier, built like a bulldozer, with arms thick as firewood. Jake squinted at the group gathered outside the gate. "What's going on here, cuz?" Karen seized her chance. "Good witnesses," she cried as though they were a jury. "These men are trespassing. We have orders to remove him." Mark rubbed his eyes, yawning like a bear. "Trespassing, lady. This is his cabin. He owns it." "That's irrelevant," Karen snapped, waving her clipboard. "The HOA has jurisdiction here. These are my officers, and they have authority to enter." Jake stepped forward, arms crossed, towering like a statue. "Officers," he tilted his head, studying the mismatched uniforms, the discount patches, the nervous shifting. "You boys look more like mall cops who lost their Segways." The insult landed hard. A couple of the security men muttered curses under their breath. The leader puffed up, trying to reassert control. "We're here to keep order. You civilians don't understand how serious HOA violations can be." Mark barked out a laugh. "Buddy, I've faced mortar fire overseas. You think I'm scared of your parking lot violations?" The air thickened. Karen tried to rally her troops, pointing her clipboard like a sword. "Don't let them intimidate you. They're bluffing. Move in." But no one moved. They exchanged uncertain glances, shifting their boots on the gravel. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone 2 Army veterans staring them down like drill sergeants inspecting raw recruits. I folded my arms, voice steady as steel. "This is private property. Step 1 inch onto my side of that gate, and you'll answer for trespassing in court. Or maybe sooner." Karen screeched again, stamping her heel. Do it, remove him. But the men hesitated. Their leader muttered something about needing clarification. Another rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly very interested in the dirt beneath his boots. Karen's fury bubbled over. She turned to me, eyes blazing. This isn't over. You think you can just laugh at the HOA. You'll regret mocking me. I smirked. Karen, the only thing I regret is not bringing popcorn. Inside, my cousins chuckled. Outside, the security men shuffled uncomfortably, their fake authority unraveling under the weight of the standoff. And that's when I heard it, the faintest sound carried on the mountain wind. A low, steady rumble. At first, it could have been thunder. But I knew better. My cousins knew better. Even the so-called security guys perked up, sensing something primal in that sound. The roar of Harleys was coming, and everything Karen thought she controlled was about to slip through her manicured fingers. Karen wasn't the type to back down. If anything, the hesitation of her security team only made her more desperate to reassert control. Her face twisted into a mask of fury, the kind of expression that could curdle milk. She stomped toward the gate heels, digging into the gravel like a tantrum-throwing toddler who'd just been denied a toy at Walmart. You think you can laugh at me? She shrieked, clipboard quivering in her hand. This cabin is an eyesore, a stain on the neighborhood, and a danger to property values. I'll have it torn down piece by piece if I have to. Behind her, the fake security squad shifted nervously, clearly regretting whatever Craigslist ad they'd answered to land this gig. But Karen was relentless. She spun on them, her voice cracking like a whip. Surround the property now. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but eventually, like sheep following a barking dog, they spread out along the gate. Two leaned against their trucks, trying to look menacing. Another lit a cigarette, blowing smoke rings like it was his main job qualification. The leader barked half-hearted orders, but even he seemed unconvinced. My cousins didn't budge. Jake leaned on the porch rail, arms crossed, his sheer size making the officers look like high school kids cosplaying tough guys. Mark sat on the steps casually sharpening his pocket knife with a grin that said he was enjoying the show. Karen marched closer to the gate and jabbed her clipboard at me like it was a sword of authority. You can't chop wood without a permit. You can't burn leaves without HOA approval. You can't even park that rusty pickup truck unless it's registered with the board. You're breaking a dozen rules, and I won't tolerate it. I raised an eyebrow. Karen, do you hear yourself? You're standing on my driveway yelling about my firewood while your goons are blocking a public road. Which one of us sounds like the criminal? Her nostrils flared so wide I thought she might suck in her own clipboard. She whirled on her men again. Block the driveway, don't let him leave. If he won't comply, we'll make him comply. The trucks revved their engines, grumbling like hungry dogs straining at their chains. Dust swirled up from the gravel as the so-called security vehicles shifted into position, effectively trapping me in my own home. It might have been intimidating if it weren't so utterly pathetic. Jake chuckled low in his throat. They're trying to blockade a cabin with phone 150 seconds. Cute. Mark spat into the dirt, then looked at me. Want us to handle this, 'cause... I shook my head. Not yet. Let them dig their own hole a little deeper. Karen overheard and took my calmness as a sign of weakness. Her eyes gleamed with triumph as though she'd finally cornered her prey. That's right, she sneered. You have nowhere to run. I'm calling the sheriff, and when he arrives, he'll see you're an illegal squatter. You'll be dragged out of here in handcuffs. I couldn't help it. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The sheriff, Karen, you called him last month when I installed my mailbox. Remember what he told you, ma'am? He owns that land, leave him alone. You think he's going to drive up here just to watch you embarrass yourself again? Her face turned the color of ripe tomatoes. She stomped her heel so hard the gravel scattered. Shut up. You think this is funny? You won't be laughing when the HOA finds you into bankruptcy. Jake muttered under his breath. She really doesn't know when to quit. But Karen wasn't finished. She pulled a megaphone out of the back of her SUV, a megaphone, and started shouting into it like a deranged auctioneer. Attention, you are, in violation of HOA law. Comply immediately or face removal. This is your final warning. Her voice echoed off the mountainside, scaring a few birds out of the trees. Even the security men winced at the volume. Mark leaned back, grinning. Well, she's officially lost her mind. I sighed, finally setting my mug down on the porch railing. Karen, you can scream into that thing all day, but the only law that matters here is the one written on my deed. And last time I checked, your HOA has no jurisdiction over a pine cone, let alone my cabin. She snapped the megaphone off and pointed her finger at me again. You'll regret this. I'll tear this place down myself if I have to. That's when the air shifted. At first it was faint, just a low vibration in the ground, barely noticeable over the rumble of the idling trucks. But then it grew louder, rolling like distant thunder across the valley. A deep, guttural roar that didn't belong to nature. The security men froze cigarettes, dropping sunglasses, lifting. Even Karen hesitated mid-rant, her words cut off by the unmistakable sound approaching from over the ridge. Jake and Mark exchanged knowing smiles. Jake tilted his head toward the horizon. Sounds like the cavalry's on the way. Karen tried to regain her composure, waving her clipboard. Ignore it, probably just locals. But her voice wavered, betraying the cracks in her confidence. I smiled slow and steady, savoring the moment. Not locals, Karen. Family. The roar of Harleys grew louder, echoing through the trees like a rolling army. Dust rose on the far road, and the faint shimmer of chrome caught the morning light. My cousins straightened, grinning ear to ear. The so-called security team looked like they were watching a storm cloud bear down on them. And Karen's smug confidence melted into something new: doubt. She didn't know it yet, but her little game of intimidation had just ended. The real show was about to begin. The sound carried across the valley like a living thing. At first it was just a faint hum, the kind of noise you could almost mistake for distant thunder. But then it rolled closer, louder, steadier, until the gravel under my boots began to tremble. That was no storm cloud. That was horsepower raw and unapologetic. Karen froze mid-screech, her megaphone slipping down to her side. The HOA security squad exchanged uneasy glances, their tough guy postures suddenly cracking. Every man there had heard that sound before, even if they'd never admit it, the unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidsons approaching in formation. Jake smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "Guess our boys are awake," he said. Mark chuckled, flicking his pocket knife closed with a snap. "Right on schedule." I let a grin creep across my face, savoring the suspense. "Karen, you ever hear a war drum? Because that's what you're listening to." Her jaw tightened, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. It's just traffic," she stammered, voice losing its earlier authority. "Traffic?" I raised a brow. "Up here on a dead-end mountain road, lady, the only traffic we get is deer crossing." The sound grew louder, the deep rumble now joined by the occasional rev that split the air like a thunderclap. The trees along the ridge seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sight glimmers of chrome flashing through the branches, black leather cutting against the morning Sunday. The security leader tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. Who exactly is that?" he muttered. Jake leaned forward on the railing. That's family." And he wasn't exaggerating. These weren't just any riders. My cousins had brought their brothers in arms, fellow veterans, men who'd fought overseas, seen things that would make these HOA rent-a-cops cry into their mama's mac and cheese. They didn't ride alone. They rode together always. I thought back to the last time I'd seen them in full force, a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers ago, when they'd rolled into town like a steel hurricane. People stopped what they were doing just to watch them pass. There was something about the synchronized rumble of a Harley pack part, pride part warning that made everyone sit up a little straighter. And now, that same sound was bearing down on my cabin. Karen's face twitched. She lifted her megaphone again, fumbling for words, but all that came out was a nervous screech. Stand your ground, they're nobodies. This doesn't concern them." But her men weren't buying it. One of them shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his truck like he was calculating how fast he could get out of there. Another tried to act cool, blowing smoke from his cigarette, but his hand trembled as he flicked the ashes. Mark whispered just loud enough for them to hear, "You boys ever seen a hornet's nest get kicked? Because that's about what's coming over that hill." I couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Karen, you sent a handful of weekend warriors in polos. I've got combat veterans who roll with steel and leather. You might want to rethink your strategy." Her voice cracked. "No, they're not allowed here. This is private HOA property." Jake barked out a laugh so deep it echoed off the cabin walls. "Lady, you keep saying that like repeating it makes it true. Hate to break it to you, but this isn't HOA land. And even if it was, you really want to try to block them?" As if on cue, the Harleys roared over the crest of the hill engines, snarling like lions. Sunlight glinted off chrome handlebars and mirrored visors. The riders came in tight formation, tires spitting dust as they descended the road toward us. There must have been at least a dozen of them, massive men in leather vests, military patches stitched proudly on their backs. Some had helmets, some didn't, but every one of them carried the same aura, disciplined, unshakable, and utterly fearless. The effect was instant. The so-called security squad lost whatever swagger they had left. One of them muttered, "Aw, hell no," and took a step back. The leader swallowed hard, trying to stand tall, but his voice faltered as he whispered, "Stay cool, stay cool." Karen, however, was too far gone to retreat gracefully. She puffed out her chest clipboard, shaking in her grip, and shouted, "Don't let them intimidate you. They're just bikers. This is HOA business." But her words were drowned out by the roar of engines as the pack rolled up, fanning out across the road like a wall of chrome and thunder. Dust rose around them, sunlight flashing off polished tanks. They slowed in unison engines, growling low, filling the air with a vibration that rattled every window of the cabin. Jake grinned like a wolf. Showtime. The riders parked in perfect formation, kickstands slamming down in rhythm. One by one, they swung their legs off the bikes and stood tall. My cousins took point, leading the group toward the gate, with the calm confidence of men who'd stared down far worse than a suburban dictator and her dollar store security team. Karen's voice shrank to a squeak. This is illegal. Noise pollution." I almost pitied her. Almost. The security men were sweating bullets. Now their earlier bravado replaced with nervous shuffling and darting eyes. None of them wanted to be the first to step up against a wall of veterans in leather. And me, I just leaned on the porch rail, coffee mug back in hand, grinning ear to ear. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Karen was about to realize she had picked the wrong fight on the wrong day against the wrong family. The roar of the Harleys didn't just fill the valley, it owned it. Every piston stroke was a drumbeat, every rev a war cry. The ground itself seemed to hum a vibration that rolled through the soil and rattled the glass panes in my cabin windows. Karen tried to shout over it, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. This is trespassing. You can't just ride in here like you own the place." Her voice cracked, and even with the megaphone, it sounded pitiful against the thunder of 12 Harley engines idling in unison. Her security squad was visibly shaken now. The bravado had drained from their faces, replaced with the wide-eyed look of men who suddenly realized they'd made a career-ending mistake. The leader adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, but his hands trembled. One of his men muttered, "We weren't paid enough for this," while another quietly shuffled toward his truck, like maybe, just maybe, he could slip away unnoticed. Jake leaned casually against the porch railing, arms crossed, enjoying every second. "That sound, fellas," he called out over the engines, "that's freedom. You might want to get used to it, 'cause it's not stopping anytime soon." Mark chuckled, spinning his knife idly in his hand. "And if you think we're intimidating, just wait till these boys start talking." The riders killed their engines in near-perfect unison, and the sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the roar had been. Dust settled around them as they swung off their bikes and stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of leather steel and discipline. Their vests bore military patches, units, tours, badges of service that made the HOA security logos look like kindergarten crafts. The leader of the riders, my cousin Danny, pulled off his helmet, revealing a face weathered by desert sun and battlefields far from this mountain. His eyes scanned the scene slowly, Karen red-faced and trembling, the fake security squad shifting uneasily, me standing calm on my porch with my coffee mug raised like a toast. Danny's voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to shout. "What's going on here?" Karen, to her credit, tried to rally. She stepped forward, clipboard shaking in her grip, and blurted, "These men, these bikers are trespassing. This is HOA territory. They have no right to be here." Danny tilted his head, studying her like she was some kind of curious insect. "HOA territory." He gestured at the gate, the gravel, the cabin behind me. "Funny, looks like private land to me." "It is private," she snapped. "Private under HOA authority?" The riders chuckled, a low rolling laugh that cut through her words like a chainsaw through balsa wood. Danny smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Lady, we've been to countries where people claim all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you claim. What matters is what's real. And what's real here is that you're trespassing on my cousin's land." Karen sputtered, waving her clipboard like it could magically transform into a badge. I have bylaws, I have jurisdiction." Another rider stepped forward, Tommy, a mountain of a man with arms covered in tattoos of eagles and anchors. He leaned close enough that Karen had to crane her neck to look up at him. "Sweetheart, the only jurisdiction you've got is over whether you want your latte iced or hot. So why don't you put the clipboard down before you hurt yourself?" The security men flinched as the veterans closed ranks, but Karen refused to retreat. Her face twisted into a snarl. "Don't let them scare you," she screeched at her men. "You're HOA security. You're stronger than they are." But the words fell flat. The rent-a-cops looked at the riders, then at each other, and not one of them stepped forward. The leader swallowed hard, his mirrored shades slipping down his nose. Danny took another step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You call this security?" He glanced at the patchwork uniforms, the fake badges, the nervous stances. Back where we come from, security means watching each other's backs, not bullying civilians for pocket change. Mark, still seated on the porch steps, barked out a laugh. They're not even good at bullying. I've seen Girl Scouts with more backbone. The security men bristled, but none dared answer. One of them scratched his arm, nervously mumbling something about miscommunication. Another pretended to check his phone as though he had urgent business elsewhere. Karen, however, doubled down. She raised the megaphone again, her voice shrill. "You can't intimidate me. I'll have you all arrested. This is HOA." The riders laughed again, but this time it wasn't amused. It was dark, heavy, the kind of laugh that let you know they weren't the ones who should be afraid. Danny leaned in, lowering his voice to a near whisper that still carried across the silence. "Lady, I've dealt with warlords who had more legitimacy than you. And you know what happened to them?" Karen's eyes widened, but she didn't answer. Danny straightened, spreading his arms as if inviting her to test him. They learned when it was time to walk away. The tension was thick enough to slice. The security squad shifted from foot to foot, none willing to step into the ring. Karen's hands trembled, clipboard rattling against her thigh. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Then the riders fired up their Harleys again. Engines roared in unison, a deafening wall of sound that shook the trees and drowned out Karen's futile attempts to shout. Dust billowed into the air, swirling around her like a storm. Her security men flinched, covering their ears, stumbling backward toward their trucks. The leader shouted something about falling back that no one could hear over the roar. And me, I just raised my coffee mug, smiling. The cavalry had arrived. The Harleys thundered like a living wall of steel and fired their engines, pounding the air until even the trees seemed to shake. The so-called HOA security couldn't hide their fear anymore. They flinched, shuffled backward, and clutched their belts like they were hoping to find courage in empty holsters. Karen, though, she refused to break. Her red suit flashed in the sunlight, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Her voice wobbled, but she forced it into a scream. "This is illegal. You have no right to intimidate my security team. You'll all be sued." Danny, my cousin, calmly removed his leather gloves and tucked them into his belt. He stepped closer to the gate boots, crunching slowly on gravel. "Lady, no one here is intimidating your men. They're doing a fine job of scaring themselves." That got a laugh from the riders, a rough rolling sound that sent another wave of unease through the fake security squad. Jake leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. She still thinks she's in control. Bless her heart. Mark grinned, sharpening his pocket knife in slow, deliberate strokes. Not for much longer. The riders began to fan out, a dozen leather-clad veterans forming a half-circle across the road. Their Harleys idled behind them, still rumbling like war drums that hadn't finished their song. Each man carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stood under real fire. The contrast was stark. On one side, disciplined veterans with calm eyes. On the other, a gaggle of jittery HOA, rent-a-cop sweat pouring under their cheap polos. The leader of the fake security crew finally stepped forward, though his voice betrayed his nerves. "All right, everyone, calm down. We're just here to enforce HOA compliance. No need for trouble." Danny tilted his head. "Trouble? You marched onto my cousin's property with trucks, uniforms, and threats. You already brought trouble. The question is, how do you want to leave?" The man's lips tightened. He looked at Karen for backup, but she was too busy shrieking into her megaphone. "Don't listen to them. You have authority. Remove him from this cabin. That is an order." Her words rang hollow. Even her own officers didn't budge. They shuffled, avoiding eye contact as if hoping someone else would make the first move. Danny stepped closer, still so close the leader had to tilt his chin up to meet his gaze. "You hear that? That's not leadership. That's desperation. And I don't think you boys signed up to be cannon fodder for a clipboard queen." The silence that followed was deafening. The riders watched like hawks, waiting for the first spark. My cousin stood ready, Jake tall as a mountain, Mark broad as a wall. And me, I just sipped my coffee, letting the scene unfold. Finally, one of the fake security men cracked. He muttered something about not being paid enough, turned on his heel, and walked back toward his truck. Another quickly followed. The leader cursed under his breath, trying to call them back, but his voice lacked conviction. Karen nearly choked on her own fury. "Cowards. I'll have you all fired." Danny smirked. "Fired? From what? Pretending to be police officers?" The riders laughed again, the sound echoing like a storm through the valley. The last few officers hesitated, shifting from foot to foot, clearly torn between pride and survival. Karen tried one last tactic. She marched up to the gate, slamming her clipboard against the bars. "Listen to me, these men are criminals. If you don't stop them, the entire neighborhood will suffer." Danny's eyes hardened, his voice turning cold. Lady, I fought overseas so people like you could never claim power they don't have. You're not law, you're not order, you're just noise. With that, he turned and gave a subtle nod to the riders. In unison, they revved their Harleys again. The engines roared louder than before, deafening, filling every inch of air with vibration. Dust shot up in clouds, gravel rattled under the force, and the security men stumbled backward, hands clamped over their ears. The leader dropped the act. He bolted for his truck, shouting, "Fall back, let's get out of here." Within seconds, doors slammed, engines sputtered, and tires spun, kicking up dirt as the trucks peeled away down the mountain road. Karen was left alone, standing in a cloud of dust, her hair blown wild, her clipboard hanging limp at her side. Her eyes darted from the riders to me, fury and fear wrestling inside her. I raised my mug in a mock toast. "Guess your army just went AWOL, Karen." The riders roared with laughter, some clapping each other on the back. My cousins joined in, grinning from ear to ear. And for the first time that day, Karen didn't have a single word left to say. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen never quit. She'd be back with something dumber, louder, and even more desperate. Still, for the moment, the message was clear. She'd brought fake soldiers to my land. I had brought real ones, and there was no mistaking who had won this round. The dust hadn't even settled from the fleeing trucks when Karen finally realized the position she was in. Her army was gone, her clipboard was useless, and a dozen leather-clad veterans were staring at her with the kind of calm that was far more terrifying than rage. She tried to straighten her blazer, brushing dirt off the sleeves, but her hands were shaking too badly to make it look graceful. Her red lipstick was smeared from shouting into the megaphone, and her hair, normally styled to perfection, was now frizzed and tangled from the Harley wind. Jake broke the silence first, his voice deep and steady. "So Karen, what's the plan now? You gonna find the coyotes, maybe issue a citation to the squirrels?" The riders laughed low and rumbling, the sound rolling like thunder. Mark added, "Don't forget the creek. I bet it didn't file its water usage permit." Karen's face flushed crimson. "This isn't over," she shrieked, jabbing her clipboard toward me as if the paper inside could shield her. "You think you've won. You've only made it worse for yourself." Danny took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His presence alone made her stumble back. "Lady, worse for him. He's got family, neighbors who respect him, and a deed that says this land is his. You've got what? A stack of fake fines and a bruised ego." Karen's voice cracked. I'll call the sheriff right now. He'll arrest every one of you." I raised my mug and grinned. "Go ahead. He's been here before. Remember last time you dragged him up here, he told you to stop wasting his time. Maybe this time he'll bring handcuffs, but not for me." That one hit hard. Karen's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but all she found were leather jackets, military patches, and smirks. She tried again, her voice trembling. You're all dangerous. Intimidation is illegal. You'll pay for this." Tommy, the tattooed giant, crossed his arms and leaned down until his face was inches from hers. "Dangerous, ma'am. If we were dangerous, you wouldn't still be standing." Her mouth opened, then closed, no words coming out. She backed away, a step, heels wobbling on the uneven gravel. Meanwhile, the riders weren't letting the moment go. One by one, they stepped closer, not threatening, just surrounding her with presence. Each man radiated the kind of authority Karen could only pretend to have. They didn't need clipboards or fake badges. They had earned respect the hard way, and it showed. Mark finally broke the tension with a grin. "Hey, 'cause maybe we should let her write us a ticket for excessive intimidation." The group erupted in laughter again. Even I couldn't hold back. I took another sip of coffee and said, "Don't forget noise pollution. These Harleys aren't exactly whisper quiet." Karen's head snapped toward me, her eyes wild. "That's right, noise pollution. I'll fine you for every decibel. You'll owe the HOA thousands." Danny shook his head slowly, almost pitying her. "Lady, you're standing on land you don't control, surrounded by men who don't answer to you. Maybe it's time you stop pretending your clipboard is a weapon." But she refused to let go. She stomped her heel again, pointing her megaphone at the riders. "You're nothing but thugs on motorcycles. This whole neighborhood is sick of you." I raised an eyebrow. Funny, considering half the neighborhood came by last week to borrow firewood and thank me for fixing the bridge the HOA ignored. That shut her up for half a beat. Her jaw worked, but no words came out. And then, as if on cue, a couple of neighbors actually peeked out from down the road. Phones in hand, they recorded the whole spectacle. One shouted, "Hey Karen, your security just ran like scared puppies." The laughter that followed broke Karen's last shred of control. She spun in a circle, screaming, "Stop filming, this is official hoe business." But no one listened. The riders smirked. My cousins shook their heads. The neighbors laughed louder. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was being humiliated on her own stage. Finally, Karen's hands dropped her clipboard, hanging limp. Her breathing was ragged, her face pale beneath the layers of makeup. She looked less like a ruler and more like someone who had just realized the empire she built was nothing more than a sandcastle washed away by the tide. Danny softened his tone just enough to drive the point home. Karen, go home. You've embarrassed yourself enough for one day. Don't make us say it twice. For a moment I thought she might explode again. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted like a trapped animal's. But then she turned sharply on her heel, nearly tripping, as her stilettos caught in the gravel and stormed back toward her SUV. The riders watched her climb inside, slam the door, and peel out in a cloud of dust. Her engine sputtered down the road, the sound fading into the distance. Silence fell over the valley again. The only noise was the slow ticking of cooling Harley engines. Jake exhaled, finally breaking the quiet. Well, that was entertaining. Mark grinned. Think she learned her lesson? I shrugged, sipping the last of my coffee. Karen learned a lesson? Not likely. But she definitely learned she picked the wrong fight today. The riders laughed again, their voices booming across the ridge. For now, the battle was over, but deep down I knew Karen's panic was just the beginning of her next desperate move. Karen's SUV vanished around the bend, kicking up a long trail of dust like a retreating army waving a white flag. But her security squad hadn't all managed such a dramatic exit. A few of their trucks still lingered down the gravel road, engines idling as if the men inside couldn't quite decide whether to stay or run. Danny turned toward them, his leather vest catching the sunlight. "What's it gonna be, boys?" he asked calmly. "You want to keep playing pretend, or you want to leave with what's left of your dignity?" The men didn't answer right away. The leader, the one with the mirrored shades, sat frozen behind the wheel of his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. He glanced nervously at his crew, then at the riders still fanned out in their wall of leather and chrome. Jake muttered from the porch, "They look like kids who just realized the schoolyard bully doesn't run the playground anymore." Mark chuckled. "Nah, they look like kids who just peed themselves in dodgeball." The riders roared with laughter, and the sound carried down the road like a hammer striking an anvil. The fake security men flinched at the noise, shifting uneasily in their seats. One of them finally cracked, throwing his truck into reverse, so fast the tires squealed against the gravel. He turned, gunned it, and sped down the road in the same direction Karen had gone. That broke the dam. Another truck followed, fishtailing in the dust. Then another. Soon the only one left was the leader. His truck sat idling, trembling, as though even the machine itself wanted to flee. Danny stepped forward, boots slow and steady, his voice dropping to that quiet intensity only a soldier could pull off. "Son, you've got two choices. Drive away now, or find out what it feels like to explain to the sheriff why you're trespassing with a fake badge." The man's jaw tightened, but there was no fight left in him. He muttered something that sounded a lot like "to hell with this" and slammed the gear shift. His truck lurched forward, bouncing off the ruts as he sped away down the ridge. The road fell silent again. Dust hung in the air like the last breath of a storm. One of the riders spat into the dirt. "That's it, that's her army. I was hoping for a workout." Another laughed. "Easiest victory we've ever had." I finally set down my empty mug and walked down the steps to stand beside my cousins. "Told you all I said. Karen can't build an empire without it crumbling on her." Jake smirked. "Yeah, but she sure knows how to waste everyone's time." Mark shook his head, pocket knife sliding back into his jeans. "I'll give her credit for one thing, she's stubborn. Stupid stubborn, but still stubborn." The riders started their Harleys again, the engines firing up one by one. The valley shook with the sound, but this time it wasn't intimidation, it was celebration. Some revved their throttles, grinning wide. Others raised their fists in salute to me on the porch. Danny turned back, his expression softening. "'Cause you handled yourself well. Kept calm, let her dig her own hole." I shrugged. She brought fake cops, I brought real soldiers. Not exactly a fair fight. That earned another round of laughter from the riders. Just then I noticed a few more neighbors had crept out to watch from the edge of the road. Phones were still recording. One older man raised a hand in greeting. "Don't worry, we'll spread the word. Everybody's gonna know she tried to send her security team after you, and they ran like chickens." I grinned. "Good. Let her reputation collapse under its own weight." The riders mounted up again, chrome glinting in the sunday. They didn't leave immediately, though. Instead, they lined their bikes in formation, revved their engines in perfect rhythm, and let out one final earth-shaking roar. It wasn't just noise. It was a message that said, "Don't mess with family. Don't mess with freedom. And for God's sake, don't mess with Harley riders who've seen real war." The neighbors cheered, clapping from the sidelines. The so-called HOA security was gone, and Karen was licking her wounds somewhere down the mountain. I stood there on the porch watching the riders salute before rolling off in perfect formation, engines echoing down the valley long after they were out of sight. The sight filled me with a mix of pride and relief. Karen had tried to break me with intimidation, but all she'd done was expose herself as a fraud. Jake patted my shoulder. "Think she'll try again?" I sighed, shaking my head. "With Karen, absolutely. But next time, she'll be even more desperate. And that's when she'll make her biggest mistake yet." Mark grinned wide. "Well, when she does call us, we'll bring more friends." I laughed, finally letting the tension roll off my shoulders. For now, at least, the battle was over. The mountain was quiet again. But something told me Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The valley settled into silence after the last Harley rumbled out of sight. For the first time all morning, I could hear the creek again, trickling softly behind the cabin. The chaos, the shouting, the dust, it all felt like a storm that had finally passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. Jake stretched his massive arms and let out a satisfied sigh. "Well, that's one way to start the day." Mark laughed, kicking at the gravel with his boot. "Beats coffee for waking you up." I raised my empty mug. "Not for me. Coffee always wins." The riders who had stayed behind shared a good laugh. They clapped one another on the back, joking about how fast the security had fled, mimicking the squeal of their tires like children imitating cartoon villains. For a group of hardened veterans, they sure knew how to enjoy a victory. The neighbors, too, seemed energized by what they'd witnessed. A woman from down the road approached cautiously, her phone still recording. We saw everything she said with a smile. "Karen can scream all she wants, but the whole neighborhood knows the truth now. You don't answer to her." I nodded, tipping my head in thanks. "Glad you saw it for yourself. The HOA doesn't get to write history when the people are holding the cameras." Her grin widened. "I'll be sharing this with everyone. She won't live this down." The riders cheered at that, and even Jake let out a loud whistle. Nothing like a little internet humiliation to shut down a dictator. But I wasn't celebrating too quickly. If I knew Karen, and unfortunately I did, her pride was too big to let today's disaster be the end of it. Sure enough, 2 days later I found a crisp white envelope stuffed into my mailbox. No return address, but the bold HOA logo was stamped on the front like a scarlet letter. I carried it inside, sat at my wooden table, and slit it open with the same knife I used to carve kindling. The letter inside was as absurd as it was predictable. Notice of violation, infraction, noise pollution, fine $4, 750 reason use of excessive unlawful motorcycle noise, disturbing community ambiance and property values. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee across the page. Property values, community ambiance, Karen had actually tried to find me because my cousin's Harleys sounded scary. Jake read over my shoulder and slapped his knee. 4,000 for noise pollution, those bikes were music. Mark smirked. "Frame it. Put it on the wall next to the deer rack." A trophy. And that's exactly what I did. I tacked the fine above the fireplace, right between a pair of elk antlers. Every time I looked at it, I didn't see a debt. I saw proof of victory. Proof that Karen had thrown her biggest punch and missed by a mile. The neighbors heard about it, of course. Word spread fast in the valley. Folks dropped by with casseroles, firewood, and sly grins. One older gentleman shook my hand firmly and said, "Son, you've done what none of us could. You stood up to her. We all thank you for that." The gratitude warmed me more than the fire in the hearth. It wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had bullied the entire community for years with her bylaws, her fines, her letters written in red ink. People had been scared, embarrassed, worn down. But now they saw she could be beaten. Still, Karen wasn't done, not entirely. A week later, I caught her SUV creeping past my driveway at dusk, slowing just enough for her to glare through the tinted glass. She didn't stop, she didn't say a word. But her eyes told me everything she hadn't forgiven. She hadn't forgotten. I simply raised my coffee mug in salute, and she sped off down the road. The twist wasn't that Karen gave up, it was that she couldn't. The HOA fine, the retreat of her fake army, the humiliation caught on half a dozen smartphones, none of it was enough to stop her obsession. If anything, I realized today's battle was just one chapter in a war she couldn't help but keep fighting. But me, I wasn't worried. I had family, I had neighbors, I had freedom, and most of all, I had the patience to watch her keep losing over and over again. Because bullies don't stop until they're forced to face reality. And Karen's reality was simple. Her HOA empire ended where my land began. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and my cousins raised glasses of whiskey and a toast, I thought about the day's events. The fake security, the Harleys, the roar of laughter as Karen's plans crumbled. I leaned back in my chair, smiled, and said, "To freedom, and to never letting a Karen tell you how to live." The room erupted in cheers, glasses, clinking laughter filling the cabin walls, and outside the mountain stood silent and strong, holding every echo of victory. At the end of the day, this wasn't just about me, my cousins, or even Karen. It was about something bigger, the choice to stand up against intimidation, no matter what form it takes. We all face Karens in life. People who think they can control us with rules, fines, or empty threats. Sometimes they're neighbors, sometimes bosses, sometimes voices inside our own heads telling us we can't. But here's the truth: freedom doesn't come from hiding or giving in. It comes from standing tall, staying calm, and remembering you don't have to fight alone. Family, friends, community, when you have people who've got your back, even the loudest bullies lose their power. I learned that day that laughter is stronger than fear, and that dignity is worth more than property values on a clipboard. The HOA could write 1,000 fines, but they could never buy respect. And respect, that's something you earn by living true and standing firm. So if you've ever faced a Karen of your own, remember, you don't need to fight dirty, just fight steady. Stand your ground, lean on the people who love you, and let the bullies expose themselves for what they are. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever stood up to someone who tried to push you around? Drop your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this ride, hit that subscribe button and join us for more HOA drama revenge and a few well-earned laughs. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.